Israel Telseya. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Listen In. And my name is Nikki Yee. I am a colonizer of Mennonite and Chinese ancestry, and I am joining us today from the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary territories of the Quequitlem people. And would you like to introduce yourself?
I would. I'm Sarah Florence Davidson. My Haida name is Anjakku Sandlans, which means Killer Whale Woman of the Dawn. And I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Katzie, the Kwantlen, and the Semiahmoo peoples. And today we're going to be talking about becoming story ready.
Thank you. Just a little shout out, a little reminder about our purpose here. We really wanted to make scholarship accessible, as suggested by Raquel Martin, PhD is her handle, and the support learners who are just starting to engage with Indigenous story work in terms of what it means to really engage with story. So, we're talking today about becoming story ready. So, why is it important to be story ready?
And I thought when we were talking about how to organize this conversation, it was really interesting to think about the non-examples. And so Nikki suggested that we think about when are the times that this did not work out. And I think for me, my learning really solidified in that time when things, I won't say failed epically, but definitely failed. And I was relatively new. I was working with teacher candidates and doing that, what I'd spoken about before with holistic engagement with story, which involved a part where students would reenact part of the story or they would continue on what happened next. And so I was really excited about in having people engage physically with the story. I believed that it would help get that deeper meaning and have people come to sort of sit with the story a bit more. And I looked around the room and people were, um, in my mind, being disrespectful with the story. And I was really, really uncomfortable. And I initially was kind of mad with them. I'm like, wait a minute, why aren't they being respectful with this story? The story is, it's a privilege for us to be able to work with this story and learn from this story. And I realized that I really hadn't set it up well. I hadn't supported learning about the significance of what we were doing. And what I found really helpful in future times when we worked, especially with the traditional stories, was inviting the students or participants to imagine that the person who had given us permission to work with the story was in the room with us. And so, not saying that we can absolutely have fun, we can work with these stories in different ways, but imagining that person in the room with us and thinking about how would they feel in terms of how we're caring for the story, and would they be okay with how we are working with the story in this particular moment. And I found that when I front end loaded a little bit more and had some of these conversations, talked a little bit more about becoming story ready, that our experience was one that felt much more respectful to me. And so that initial and that real discomfort that I experienced in doing that really helped me solidify that learning and helped me to shift in my approach.
Yeah. And I had a similar experience where so I love the story creator in the Flea, and you can find it. It's probably in the notes, but in Indigenous Storywork, you can see all my tabs. And one of them is the creator in the Flea. And I have just read this story so many times. I've practiced it. I've read it to myself. I've read it out loud. And I just love the story. And every time I read the story, I take away something like so visceral and so new, and so I'm excited about this story and how it has really taught me and guided me in my life. And so I was excited to share this story with a group of teachers and lovely, beautiful people. Okay, lovely and beautiful people. But similarly, as you were saying, Sarah, like, I had them act out maybe parts of the story, and I was like, so shocked. I just like same thing. I just felt really uncomfortable. Um, And just, yeah, I did feel like it was an epic fail in terms of how I felt about the story, and it kind of betrayed those feelings. Like, that to me, really, I have a sense of reverence for the story, just has done so much for me in my life. And so to see it being treated in very a kind of a surface, almost a funny way,
Mhm,
I just felt so kind of embarrassed, to
mhm,
be honest, that I had set up this activity and this is where it went. And so I've really been thinking about story work, since then, and maybe being more intentional and purposeful about how I bring story into learning situations, like that, because yeah, I just don't want to ever do that again.
mhm.
But it helps us, in our thinking and how we want to be and how we want to interact. And so one of the things that we had talked about then is really what does it mean to become story ready? And what does Joanne Archibald talk about in Indigenous story work in terms of becoming story ready?
Yeah, and I think what I've appreciated in her later work is how she's looked at those Indigenous story work principles and divided them into these separate, and not that they are separate, they're all kind of lapping and connected, but how she's really focused in on the four: respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity, to be connected to this idea of becoming story ready. And what does that mean? And I've been working with the ideas, and so when I've and sort of thinking about the ideas and working with teacher candidates and educators, and then also reading books to young people, I've sort of supported them to think about how to, in that moment when I've been working with, reading stories with younger people, sort of what are some guiding questions? How do we think about these ideas? And so when we think about respect, we have this understanding of what respect means, but in the context of becoming story ready, thinking about how is it that how can we learn from stories, and in the context of becoming story ready with responsibility, how do we prepare ourselves to listen to a story? And I think sometimes we do that. You need to be sitting down with your hands in your lap or whatever it is, but I think also about what is our responsibility as a listener. And I think you spoke to that last time, but just sort of talking about that it's not just passive listening when we're engaged in this making meaning. And so this idea of becoming story ready is really thinking about what are our responsibilities as a listener. And reverence, I think about this especially with traditional stories, and not to only focus in on them. I think all stories are deserving of reverence, but I think especially when we're thinking about these traditional stories where communities or nations or individuals or families have given permission for them to be a part of our learning practice in schools or in learning settings, that we really do need to ensure that we are treating these stories with respect, which is, I think, sort of what we were learning in those kind of non-examples. And then also this idea of reciprocity, and how does that look as a listener, as when we're thinking about stories. And um, what I love, and I wish that I could remember which piece it came in, but Kwam Kwamhiam, Joanne Archibald, has talked about how do we ensure that that story can teach others, and this idea that this story lives on, and that maybe I might listen to the the creator and the flea, and I might have some learning that comes out of that, and that I can then perhaps share back with you what I've learned from that, and that idea that we are engaged in reciprocity in the context of um, becoming story ready, and sharing stories. And so um, I think I also think that we can kind of think more broadly beyond the uh, traditional stories, and I think you might have an example that you'd like to
Mhm.
share.
Yeah, and I do think like we want to think of these four principles in relation to story work. I mean, that's the whole point, right? But it also impacts how we relate to other listeners, or, like we want to bring those principles into our relationships, not only with the story, but with the people who are sort of a part of that storytelling. I don't know if you want to speak anything to that or.
I think part of and I think we spoke about it last time, just in terms of making meaning, that it's so beneficial to hear the meaning that other people are making from those stories. And so, definitely part of the process of being a good listener is how are we sharing that understanding, and how does it potentially transform the way other people are thinking about and learning from that story.
Yeah, I wanted to share this book, Berry Song. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. In Barry Song, again, this is maybe like a entry point where you can kind of see like what does it mean to have respect, to be responsible, to show reverence, to engage in reciprocal relationships. And so it's not about being story ready, but it is about those principles. And especially, I think, in relation to the land and in relationship to the little girl and her grandmother. And so to kind of see those principles in action, I think is kind of helpful because it's kind of embedded in a context and it helps us to develop our understanding of what those principles might look like, feel like, and sound like, and what that really is. So I think that's really helpful. And of course, I'm always trying to um, work this book in whenever I can. And I really think that, this is that example of relationship, right? And thinking about how all of those pieces kind of shape the relationships that we have with people and with story. And this is the kind of stories you were saying, Sarah, that it's not just about traditional stories, right? That we really want to become story ready when we're also dealing with more contemporary stories as well. So this would be the kind of story that you could sort of practice that, or not you, but a person could practice with their students or with other learners in terms of how do we become story ready, and then maybe even to come back at the end of the story and talk about, okay, well, how did we as a group practice reciprocity, respect, reverence, and which one did I miss? Reciprocity, responsibility. So, to kind of have that as an activity could be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to do another little shout out. Michaela Goade's work is stunning, and Moon Song is also it's her brand new book, and it's beautiful. Again, illustrating relationship in so many ways. So definitely check her work out. And another little shout out for maybe using these books with all learners. Definitely a lot of the work that I did when I was teaching at university level as well. Love to share picture books and teach about Indigenous pedagogies through that. And so, kind of shifting a little bit to classroom practice, I think sometimes there's a bit of again, how do we do this in the classroom? So I think you've got a great example to potentially share with folks.
Yeah, so I teach a university course, actually about learning and development, and really wanting to bring story in, and really wanting to bring in these principles that Joanne Archibald talks about. And so we have different practices that we do. We have readings where, we're reading the first chapter in Indigenous Storywork that talks about the different story work principles and getting ready for story work. We have a practice of reciprocity where students, sort of give something of themselves every class to sort of reciprocate or in response to the learning that's co-constructed among students and in our community of learning. And this idea that we are then responsible to people if they have shared their reciprocity with us in order to support their learning. And so we do talk about these ideas, but what I'd really like to do is kind of dive in a bit deeper in terms of becoming story ready and really signal that a little more explicitly. And so that when we're dealing with story, students are approaching it, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier with that sense of reverence, and respect that we would hope could facilitate true learning. Because I think without that, it's hard to really make meaning if you're not taking the story seriously, right? And so these are entry points so that people can actually dive deeper into the meaning.
And I so appreciate you being willing to share. Like, I think it's important to note that we're definitely not experts at this. We try out different things and we like to think about it and we love to chat about it. So, I do find in these conversations, I start thinking about, well, what is the next step in my classroom practice or in the work that I'm doing. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes, thank you. And so we have some resources for further learning. We have the creator and the flea in the notes, berry song, moon song, and a little video. Is it a video, Sarah,
Yeah,
about
it's a
becoming story
fantastic
ready?
video with Kwam Kwam Hyam, Joanne Archibald talking about becoming story ready. And so any opportunity to get a chance to listen to her speak directly is a treat. So encourage you to check that out.
Yes. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights, Sarah. And
Thank you.
we look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay, talk to you later.